Chapter 1. The Stranger on the Green. It was the sort of morning that made even the hedgerows hum with gossip. The sun peeked gently through maple leaves in golden dabs, and the village of Maplewick was abuzz with excitement over the annual summer fête. Stalls lined the green, bunting fluttered merrily in the breeze, and children ran about with sticky toffee apples and jam-stained fingers. Jessica Fletcher had arrived only the day before to visit her cousin, Eleanor Prescott, a retired schoolmistress with a fondness for lavender and a reputation for knowing everything about everyone, though she'd never admit to it outright. Maplewick, tucked just beyond the Wiltshire hills, reminded Jessica fondly of Cabot Cove, charming, self-contained, and entirely too quiet for comfort. As Jessica strolled toward the green, she spotted Eleanor flapping about near the jam stand, fiercely debating with Reverend Wilmot over whether her gooseberry preserve qualified as traditional or not. "You're just in time to witness a scandal of culinary proportions," Eleanor whispered, with a mischievous glint in her eye as Jessica joined her. Jessica chuckled. "If it gets any livelier, I might have to start taking notes for my next novel." But the real intrigue wasn't the preserves. Just past the coconut shy stood a tall man in a beige mackintosh and dark hat, quite out of place among the sun hats and garden party dresses. He held no ticket, sampled no scones, and spoke to no one. His eyes scanned the crowd with the precision of a hawk. More than once he scribbled into a slim notepad he kept tucked inside his coat. Jessica, ever the observer, noticed how his gaze lingered on the parish notice board, then on Eleanor, then quickly darted away when he saw her watching. "Who's that, Eleanor?" Jessica asked, pretending to fiddle with her handbag. "No idea," Eleanor replied, brow furrowing. "Turned up this morning, didn't speak to a soul. Been loitering near the vicarage most of the day. Some say he's a journalist, others think debt collector." "A journalist?" Jessica mused. "Or someone who wants people to think he is." Moments later, the stranger moved away from the crowd and vanished behind the church. Jessica, more curious than concerned, made a mental note to ask Reverend Wilmot about him later, but she didn't have to wait long. A sudden shout cut through the summer air like a knife. Gasps and murmurs followed as villagers ran towards the far side of the green. "Something's happened." Eleanor clutched Jessica's arm. Together they hurried past the trestle tables and around the church corner. A small crowd had already formed. Lying just behind the stone wall of the graveyard was the stranger in the mackintosh, face down, one hand clenched tightly around a crushed flower. The vicar stood pale as chalk, mumbling a prayer while Constable Greaves tried to control the gathering throng. "Stand back, please. Let's give him air," the constable barked, though it was clear from the stillness of the man's body that he no longer needed any. Jessica didn't speak. She simply observed. The ground near the body was undisturbed, save for a smudge of boot print on a nearby gravestone. A camera case, unzipped. A broken pencil in his pocket. And the flower. Crushed violet, likely from the church's rear garden. "Do we know who he is?" she asked Constable Greaves quietly. "No identification, just this notebook," he said, lifting a small spiral pad with gloved hands. "Full of odd sketches and names, mostly local ones. Yours too, Miss Fletcher." Jessica's brow lifted. "Mine?" Greaves nodded. Page 3. That evening the fête ended early, the bunting packed away in solemn silence. Over supper, Eleanor fussed over burnt stew while Jessica quietly reviewed the afternoon's events in her mind. A stranger, no name, no known reason for visiting, killed, or did he fall, mere steps from the churchyard gate. A notebook filled with Maplewick names, including hers. Jessica sipped her tea, then turned to Eleanor. "Have you noticed anything strange in the village recently? Anything out of place? Other than this unfortunate incident?" Eleanor hesitated, her spoon mid-air. "Well, now you mention it. Old Mrs. Langley's garden was broken into last week. She said her roses were trampled, but nothing was taken." Jessica nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's what's left behind that matters." And upstairs on her writing desk, Jessica placed the copy of the notebook Constable Greaves had let her read. On the last page, in rushed scrawl, the stranger had written, "Maplewick hides more than it shows." "Stand back, please. Let's give him air," the constable barked. though it was clear from the stillness of the man's body that he no longer needed any. Jessica didn't speak. She simply observed. The ground near the body was undisturbed, save for a smudge of boot print on a nearby gravestone. A camera case, unzipped. A broken pencil in his pocket, and the flower. Crushed violet, likely from the church's rear garden. "Do we know who he is?" she asked Constable Greaves quietly. "No identification, just this notebook," he said, lifting a small spiral pad with gloved hands, full of odd sketches and names, mostly local ones. "Yours too, Miss Fletcher." Jessica's brow lifted. "Mine?" Greaves nodded. "Page 3. That evening, the fête ended early, the bunting packed away in solemn silence. Over supper, Eleanor fussed over burnt stew while Jessica quietly reviewed the afternoon's events in her mind. A stranger, no name, no known reason for visiting, killed, or did he fall, mere steps from the churchyard gate. A notebook filled with Maplewick names, including hers. Jessica sipped her tea. Eleanor hesitated, her spoon mid-air. "Well, now you mention it, old Mrs. Langley's garden was broken into last week. She said her roses were trampled, but nothing was taken." Jessica nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's what's left behind that matters." And upstairs, on her writing desk, Jessica placed the copy of the notebook Constable Greaves had let her read. On the last page, in rushed scrawl, the stranger had written, "Maplewick hides more than it shows." Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Bell Tower. The church bells had not rung since the man died. Jessica Fletcher stood beneath the ancient stone bell tower of St. Michael's, its arched entrance, weather-worn and ivy-clad. The morning mist still lingered across Maplewick like a shroud, softening the edges of hedges and gravestones alike. Jessica had promised herself she wouldn't get involved, not truly, but promises made in the face of mystery rarely lasted long. She climbed the steps of the vicarage, located just behind the church. Reverend Wilmot greeted her, red-eyed and jittery. "Miss Fletcher," he said, clutching a handkerchief. "Terribly distressing business yesterday." "Indeed," Jessica replied gently. "I thought I might speak with you about it." The vicar led her to the drawing room, where the scent of old books and damp cassocks lingered. As he poured tea with a trembling hand, Jessica glanced around. One window offered a clear view of the churchyard, the very spot where the man had died. "Did you know the gentleman at all?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not in the slightest, though. He did stop me before morning prayers, asked if he might view the bell tower, said he was interested in local architecture." Jessica blinked. "You let him in?" The vicar paused. "No. I said the tower was off limits to visitors, safety concerns. But later, I noticed the side door was unlocked." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "And the keys?" Reverend Wilmot's face grew pale. "Gone. Just the one that opens the tower staircase. I thought perhaps I'd misplaced it, but now." He did not finish the thought. He didn't need to. Jessica stood, her mind already churning. "May I see the tower?" The Reverend hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, but it's dusty up there. No one's been up in years." Minutes later, Jessica found herself climbing the narrow, spiraling staircase. The air was cold and smelled of stone and bird droppings. She paused halfway up to study a worn iron latch. It looked recently oiled, curious. At the top, light streamed through slits in the walls. The great bells hung silent. On the floor, she noticed faint scuff marks near the corner, boots perhaps, and beside them, a single page torn from a hymn book, folded twice and tucked into the crack of a loose stone. She eased it out carefully. It was blank, at first. But as she tilted it toward the light, faint indentations appeared. Someone had written atop it on another sheet, a habit of hasty scribblers. Jessica smiled to herself. "Let's see what you were so eager to write, my friend." Back at the vicarage, she borrowed a pencil and lightly shaded the surface of the page. Slowly, ghostly letters came into view. "Don't trust the one who sings, her voice hides the truth." Jessica tapped the page thoughtfully. "Her voice? Is that some sort of poem?" asked the Reverend behind her. "More like a warning," she murmured. That afternoon, she visited Eleanor at her cottage. Eleanor was polishing silver and frowning at the radio. "Did you hear?" Eleanor asked. "Beatrice Langley, the choir mistress, took ill after the fête, fainted at the church. The doctor says it was nerves." Jessica's brow lifted. Beatrice Langley, you say? She hasn't sung in a week. Poor dear's been acting dreadfully odd too. Claimed someone had been following her. I told her to lie down with a cup of tea. Jessica considered the message in the hidden note. Don't trust the one who sings. A coincidence or something more? Did the stranger speak to her before the fête? Jessica asked. Eleanor pursed her lips. I couldn't say for sure, but she looked terribly upset after visiting the notice board. You think there's a connection? Jessica smiled faintly. Let's just say I've heard stranger songs sung before a storm. Outside, the bell tower stood silent, watching. But Jessica could feel it. Secrets were beginning to echo. Chapter 3. The Widow's Warning. The sun hung low behind Maplewick's sycamores as Jessica made her way up the moss-lined path to Widow Myrtle Crowthorne's cottage. Few in the village dared visit the recluse, whose gnarled garden mirrored the sharp angles of her personality. Yet whispers around the green said the dead man had called on her the day before he died. Jessica tapped the crooked iron knocker. A moment later the door creaked open. Widow Crowthorne stood there, hunched but commanding, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the warmth of the day. Her clouded eyes examined Jessica with suspicion. You're the American, she rasped. Eleanor's cousin. I am, Jessica Fletcher. May I come in for a moment? It's about the man who died by the church. The widow gave no answer, only shuffled aside to let her in. The interior was musty, heavy with dried herbs and old paper. A tabby cat glared at Jessica from a sagging armchair. He did come here, Myrtle said before Jessica could ask. Knocked on my door 3 times. Didn't wait for an invitation, just barged in. Jessica raised her eyebrows. That's very bold of him. Did he say what he wanted? The widow lowered herself into the chair. He asked questions, nosy ones, about the church, about the choir. Jessica leaned forward slightly. Did he mention anyone by name? Myrtle's lips twitched. He asked about Beatrice Langley, wanted to know if she'd been part of the choir during the fire. Jessica blinked. Fire? Aye, 20 years ago. Choir loft caught ablaze during rehearsal. 1 girl died. Terrible business. They said it was faulty wiring, but I never believed that. Jessica nodded slowly. Why not? Myrtle's voice lowered to a whisper, because someone locked the vestry door from the outside. Jessica's eyes narrowed. That was never in the reports, because the vicar at the time hushed it up, said it would distress the community. The widow scoffed. I saw it with my own eyes. The girl who died, Emmeline Palmer, sweet child, just 17, and Beatrice was there that night. Always claimed she was outside fetching sheet music, but she came back red-faced and stammering. Jessica sat back, her mind working quickly. Do you think the man who died, our stranger, was investigating the fire? I'm certain of it, Myrtle said grimly. He asked if anyone had ever been held responsible. Said he was a journalist working on a book about unresolved church tragedies. But that weren't the whole truth. Jessica tilted her head. How do you mean? He asked me one question that chilled me, Myrtle whispered. Did Emmeline Palmer have a sister? Jessica's breath caught. And did she? The widow nodded. A twin. Adopted out as a baby. Few knew. Emmeline's mother never spoke of it, but I remember clear as day, her saying, I lost one, but I still see her in my dreams twice. Jessica stood slowly. That's a very helpful memory, Mrs. Crowthorne. Thank you. As Jessica walked back into the soft dusk of Maplewick, she mulled over the widow's story. A locked vestry, a forgotten fire, a twin. She stopped suddenly by the church gate. Beatrice Langley had been at the center of it all then, and now. That evening, Jessica rang Constable Greaves. I knew you ask about an old fire, she told him. St. Michael's Church, roughly 20 years ago. He sighed. That's not something we ever closed formally. Marked it as an accidental blaze. Records are thin. What about Emmeline Palmer? Was there an autopsy? Greaves shuffled papers on the other end of the line. Yes, smoke inhalation. Tragic case. But odd thing, she was buried under a different name. Palmer was her birth name, but the record says Emmeline Holt. Holt, Jessica repeated. Why the change? No idea, said Greaves. Could be adoption, could be mistake. Want me to dig further? Please, Jessica replied. And could you check if there's anyone living in the village now with the surname Holt? She could almost hear Greaves frown. You think someone here is Emmeline's sister? I think someone here is hiding more than they're telling. And our mystery man may have uncovered something that cost him his life. Jessica set down the phone and returned to the notebook from the dead man. On the corner of the last page was a doodle, 2 identical faces, linked by a line. Below it, one word in capital letters: twins. Chapter 4. Tea with a Liar. The next morning, Jessica Fletcher arrived at the ivy-covered gate of Maplewick's bookshop with a purpose. Inside, the bell chimed softly as she entered. The scent of aged paper mingled with roasted coffee, drifting from the adjoining tea room. Behind the till stood Victor Langley, Beatrice's younger brother and Maplewick's only bookseller. Victor was a man of gentle manners and careful speech, known in the village for his vast knowledge of classic literature and his unusual fondness for prune scones. "Miss Fletcher," he greeted her with a polite smile. "Come to browse, or is this a literary emergency?" "Bit of both," Jessica said lightly, "though I could certainly do with a cup of your Darjeeling." She followed him through a curtained archway into the back tea room, where mismatched chairs surrounded 3 small tables, and a pot of tea steamed invitingly on a tray. Jessica settled in. Victor poured with a steady hand. "I assume this is about the man who died?" "Not entirely," Jessica said. "I'm interested in the fire at St. Michael's 20 years ago." Victor froze mid-pour. "Strange thing to bring up now," he said after a pause, setting the teapot down. "Is it?" Jessica asked gently. "I was told your sister was there that night, and that a young girl, Emmeline Palmer, lost her life." Victor stirred his tea. "It was a tragic accident, but surely you're not suggesting Beatrice had anything to do with it?" Jessica didn't reply at once. Instead, she glanced at the bookshelves that lined the room, where a framed photograph sat amongst old hymnals and war memoirs. She stood to take a closer look. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing to the faded photo of 2 girls in choir robes, smiling on the church steps. Victor joined her. "That's Beatrice, of course, on the right, and the girl beside her was Emmeline." Jessica studied the picture. "They look close in age." "They were," Victor said, voice softer now. "Beatrice adored her. Emmeline was like a little sister to her." Jessica turned to face him. "Is that why Beatrice collapsed, the day the stranger died?" Victor hesitated. "You've got a sharp eye, Miss Fletcher." Jessica smiled. "So I'm told." Victor sat again. "She's never forgiven herself. She insists she wasn't in the loft when the fire started, but I've always had my doubts. She was never quite the same after that day." Jessica sipped her tea. "Would you mind if I borrowed this photograph for a while? I'd like to show it to someone." He seemed reluctant, but nodded. "Of course. Just be kind to her. Beatrice isn't strong anymore." Jessica tucked the frame into her handbag and thanked him. But as she left the tea room, something gnawed at her. Back at Eleanor's cottage, she laid the photo beside the stranger's notebook. One scribbled name stood out now. Langley, music in match, fire. She stared at the photograph again. Emmeline's smile was identical to Beatrice's, almost too identical. Jessica's heart skipped. They weren't just choir friends, they looked like they could have been twins. Jessica reached for the phone and dialed Constable Greaves again. "You asked me to look into anyone in Maplewick with the surname Holt," he said when he answered. "Found something odd?" "Go on," Jessica urged. "There's no one currently listed as Holt, but a Miss Clarissa Holt lived here briefly in 2006, bought a cottage on the village edge, Rook Lane, stayed just under a year. No one saw much of her. She left suddenly, no explanation." Jessica's fingers tightened around the receiver. "And no records of her since?" "None in Wiltshire," Greaves said. "But a Clarissa Holt filed a deed of name change in Devon the following year to Clarissa Vane." Jessica's mind raced. Was she Emmeline's sister? "I haven't confirmed that yet, but if she was, it would explain a lot." Jessica thanked him and hung up. She returned to the photo. Suddenly, she noticed something strange. The church window in the background showed the year etched into the stone, 1984. The choir fire was in 1990. She stared. Victor said this was taken before the fire, but Emmeline died 6 years after this photo. Eleanor entered, drying her hands. Something wrong? Jessica showed her the photo. This picture is older than the fire. Victor told me Beatrice and Emmeline were close in age, but here they look like sisters. What if this isn't Emmeline and Beatrice at all? Eleanor looked closer. He told you Emmeline was on the left. Jessica nodded. What if he lied? She looked down at the label Victor had written on the back of the frame in faded ink. B and E. Best Choir Day. Chapter 5. The Lavender Secret. Jessica stood at Eleanor's garden gate the next morning, watching as a lanky figure trimmed the lavender bushes with practiced ease. The summer sun filtered through the branches, scenting the air with a heady perfume of crushed blooms and warm earth. "That's Henry," Eleanor said beside her, carrying out a tray with lemonade. "My gardener come Tuesdays and Fridays like clockwork. He's quiet, but he sees everything." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. "Let's hope so." Henry nodded politely as they approached. His wiry frame looked older than his 40-odd years, worn from sun and soil. His hands were rough, his face honest. "Miss Fletcher," he said in a Dorset accent, softened by time. "Pleasure." Jessica smiled. "I was hoping you could help me with something unusual. Do you recall seeing a man in a beige Macintosh near the church last Sunday?" Henry scratched his head, thinking. "Aye. Saw him sniffing about the yew trees behind the vestry. Thought it strange. Most visitors take pictures of the stained glass, not poke about the back end." Jessica leaned closer. "What was he doing?" "Just watching, really. Took notes. Walked over to the Langley cottage, then back. I saw him speak to someone near the rectory wall." Jessica's interest sharpened. "Who?" Henry's brow furrowed. Small woman. Pale hair. Looked nervous. Had a scarf. Lavender-coloured. Matched the flower beds. It did. Jessica's thoughts raced. "Beatrice?" Henry shrugged. "Could have been. But the next morning that same scarf turned up on the hedge by the church gate. Looked like someone had dropped it and run." Jessica turned to Eleanor. "Do you still have it?" "I brought it in," Eleanor said. "Thought it might belong to one of the choir ladies. Let me fetch it." She returned, moments later, with a delicate chiffon scarf, faintly scented. Jessica held it up to the light. Woven into one corner was a small stitched monogram, CV. Jessica's breath caught. "Clarissa Vane," she whispered. Eleanor looked shocked. "You think Clarissa was here?" "Not just in the village, but near the body." Jessica nodded slowly. "Henry, you said she looked nervous. Did she seem to know the man?" "Oh, definitely," he said. "They were arguing, well, quiet-like, but tense." She pointed at the church, and he showed her something in a notebook. Jessica turned the scarf over again. This wasn't dropped. It was discarded. On purpose. She excused herself shortly after and walked into the village square, scarf in hand. Her destination, Beatrice Langley's cottage. The door opened on the third knock. Beatrice stood there, wan and exhausted, her voice strained. "Miss Fletcher," she said weakly, "come in if you must." The sitting room smelled of lavender polish and old books. On the mantel sat a photograph, one identical to the one Victor had shown her. 2 girls in choir robes, the same year etched in stone behind them. Jessica took a seat. "Beatrice, I think you've been carrying a terrible burden, but you're not the only one who suffered after that fire." Beatrice stared into her teacup. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Jessica said gently. "I found a scarf near the church. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to Clarissa Vane, Emmeline's twin sister." Beatrice's hand trembled. Jessica continued. "She came to the village. She met the man who died, who I now believe was an investigative writer named Daniel Rivers. He was digging into the fire, trying to expose the truth, and someone didn't want him to. Beatrice finally looked up. Her voice was barely a whisper. I never saw Clarissa. Not since the funeral. Jessica nodded. But Victor did. Beatrice flinched. He tried to protect me, always has. He thought I was fragile after the fire, that if the truth came out I'd fall apart. Jessica's tone softened. What truth, Beatrice? A long silence, then, I didn't start the fire, but I know who did, and I kept quiet. All these years, I saw her, Clarissa, on the stairs that night. She wasn't meant to be there. Jessica's breath caught. Clarissa was in the church. Beatrice nodded, tears forming. She'd come to see Emmeline. They'd only recently discovered the truth, that they were sisters. Emmeline didn't want to keep it secret. But Clarissa, she was angry, confused. Jessica sat forward. Did she confess to you? No, but I saw her leaving through the vestry just before the smoke poured out. She had soot on her hands. She dropped a matchbook and ran. Jessica's voice was quiet. Did you ever tell anyone? I couldn't, Beatrice whispered. She'd already lost her sister. I couldn't destroy her life too. Jessica held her hand. But someone else did find out. Daniel Rivers. And now he's dead. Chapter 6. A note in the Psalter. Rain drizzled softly over Maplewick's churchyard as Jessica entered St. Michael's for morning prayers. The pews were sparsely filled, and the usual choir harmonies were absent. Beatrice Langley had not returned since her collapse. Jessica took a seat halfway down the nave. Her eyes moved, not to the altar, but to the choir loft above, the place where it all began. Reverend Wilmot approached after the brief service, his eyes weary but warm. Miss Fletcher, he said quietly, I'd hoped you might return today. Something has come up, rather odd. Jessica followed him into the vestry. There, atop a carved oak table, sat a dusty, leather-bound Psalter, the church's old book of hymns and psalms. We found this behind the lectern, he said. Hadn't been seen in years. It's not part of our usual rotation. Jessica opened the book carefully. Its spine creaked, the pages yellowed with time. Look at Psalm 94, Wilmot said, his voice hushed. Jessica turned to the page. Slipped between its leaves was a folded slip of paper. Old, brittle, and faintly singed at one corner. She removed it with great care and unfolded it. The words, written in hurried pencil, read, If you're reading this, I've failed. The girl with the lavender ribbon knows. Her voice is her mask. Jessica stared at the note. The language was unmistakable. It was Daniel Rivers' voice, and the mention of lavender again, of a voice hiding secrets, fit all too neatly. Did anyone else touch this? She asked. No one, Wilmot replied. We've kept it quiet. Jessica folded the paper again and slipped it into her handbag. Her mind ticked furiously. The girl with the lavender ribbon knows. That scarf. That argument behind the church. It could only be Clarissa Vane. But why would she return now? Outside, the rain had eased. Jessica made her way along the footpath, her thoughts heavy. As she passed the parish notice board, something caught her eye. Tucked among church rotas and fête photos was a new leaflet, slightly askew. It was an announcement for a memorial recital, scheduled for that very evening. The program included pieces from Emmeline Palmer's final choir performance, organized by none other than Victor Langley. Jessica frowned. Back at Eleanor's cottage, she found her cousin darning a cardigan. Did you know Victor's planning a recital this evening? She asked. Eleanor looked up, startled. Good heavens, no, that's sudden. Jessica showed her the note from the Psalter. Eleanor squinted. The girl with the lavender ribbon, that's Clarissa, surely. Jessica nodded. Victor must know more than he's admitted. I believe he found this Psalter earlier. He's trying to draw someone out. Eleanor frowned. Isn't that dangerous? Jessica smiled. Only if we let him do it alone. That evening the church was bathed in candlelight. Villagers sat in expectant silence, many still shaken by recent events. Jessica watched Victor as he took his place near the piano, adjusting sheet music with methodical calm, but her eyes weren't on him. They scanned the pews, pausing on a woman in the third row, tall, pale, elegant, a lavender ribbon tied at her wrist. Clarissa Vane, Jessica thought. She hadn't left after all. Victor began to play. The notes drifted through the air like ghosts of the past. As he reached the second piece, Emmeline's favorite, Jessica moved quietly down the aisle and slid into the pew behind Clarissa. "Beautiful choice," she said softly. Clarissa tensed. Slowly she turned her head. "I knew someone would notice me," she murmured. Jessica kept her voice calm. "Why come back now?" "I wanted to stop him," Clarissa whispered, eyes forward. "Daniel wouldn't listen. He said the truth had to come out, that the village deserved it, but he didn't know what it would do to her. To Beatrice." Jessica was silent for a moment. "Did you warn him off?" Clarissa's hands tightened in her lap. "I begged him to stop, to leave it alone. But he didn't." Clarissa shook her head. "I followed him. I wanted to talk. Just talk. He got angry. He said he'd put it in print anyway. I panicked." "Did you kill him?" Jessica asked softly. Clarissa turned, startled. "No, I swear it. I ran. I threw my scarf away so no one would recognize me. I left before dusk. I never saw him again." Jessica studied her face. There was fear there, but also sincerity. "Then someone else knew," she murmured. "Someone who saw the argument, someone who feared what Daniel might say." As the final notes of the hymn faded, Victor closed the piano and stood to thank the audience. Jessica watched him closely. He did not look at Clarissa, not once. Chapter 7. The Mask Falls at Midnight. The village of Maplewick had not seen a candlelit vigil in over a decade, but tonight the bell tower stood silent as the locals gathered with flickering lanterns and shadowed hearts. Jessica Fletcher moved through the churchyard as the clock approached midnight, her torchlight dancing along damp stone. She had spoken quietly to Constable Greaves earlier and made just one suggestion. "Let the vigil proceed, but keep your eyes open."
She had also made a subtle change to the vicar's bookshelf.
Inside the church, rows of candles lined the aisle. Reverend Wilmot murmured prayers, while Victor Langley stood by the organ with a sheaf of hymn sheets. His face bore no emotion, but Jessica's instincts told her the recital had been more than a tribute. It was a lure. Clarissa Vane sat at the far end of the fourth pew, her lavender ribbon now tucked away, eyes downcast. She had come again, brave or foolish. Jessica admired her resolve but couldn't shake the feeling she had left something out. As the last candle was extinguished and the villagers began to depart, Jessica waited behind. The church emptied slowly. Clarissa paused to nod at Jessica before slipping into the shadows. Jessica didn't follow her. Instead, she turned toward the lectern, where she had placed a duplicate of the Psalter, an exact copy, complete with a replica of the note inside, the real one now with the police. The fake? A trap. She slipped behind the curtain near the sacristy and waited. And then she heard it. Soft footsteps. Slow. Careful. Someone returned. The figure entered the church, hood up, moving in near darkness with only the dim moonlight through stained glass to guide them. Jessica held her breath as the person reached the lectern and opened the Psalter. A flick of a match. The faint glow illuminated the face for just a second, but long enough. Victor Langley. He tore the note from the book, crumpled it, and stuffed it into his coat. Jessica stepped from the shadows. "Looking for answers, Victor," she said. He froze, then turned slowly. "You set me up." "I had to. The real Psalter is in police hands now, along with the fingerprints from the original note." Victor gave a hollow laugh. "And what do you think that proves, Jessica?" "That I killed Daniel Rivers." Jessica stepped closer. "I think you lured him here with promises of material for his book. I think you fed him the story of Emmeline and Clarissa. And when he got too close to the truth, you panicked." Victor's expression twisted. He was going to expose her, Beatrice, say she knew about the fire, about Clarissa. Jessica kept her tone calm. He had no proof she was guilty of anything. "No," Victor admitted, "but the court of public opinion doesn't need proof. Beatrice wouldn't survive that scandal. You've seen her, fragile as glass. That fire nearly destroyed her once." "So you killed for her?" Jessica asked gently. He flinched. I tried to warn him off. He laughed in my face, said tragedy sells, that he'd already sent half the manuscript to his publisher. Jessica's voice softened. You followed him after the fête. You confronted him near the graveyard. Victor nodded slowly. I just meant to scare him, but he turned suddenly. He tripped, hit his head on the stone. It wasn't planned. Jessica sighed. You left him there. I didn't know he was dead until morning, Victor said. When I saw the constable arrive, I knew it was over. Jessica looked at him with quiet sadness. You let the village grieve a man whose name you wouldn't even say aloud. You tried to hide the past, Victor, but it never stays buried. Footsteps echoed behind them. Constable Greaves entered, having heard enough. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Victor's shoulder. It's time, he said simply. Victor didn't resist. As they walked out into the night, Clarissa appeared near the door, having returned unseen. She looked at Jessica with wide eyes. He did it for Beatrice, she asked. Jessica nodded. Out of misguided love. Clarissa's voice trembled. She never knew. She still believes I caused the fire. Jessica laid a hand on her arm. Then it's time you told her the truth. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moonlight fell on the old stones like silver thread, binding the village together once more. And Jessica Fletcher, notebook in hand, began writing the final chapter. Chapter 8. Truth in the Stone. The morning sun rose gently over Maplewick, brushing the rooftops with gold and melting away the last traces of fog. A soft breeze rustled through the churchyard yew trees, whispering secrets that had long been buried. Jessica Fletcher stood beside Emmeline Palmer's weathered gravestone. The inscription was simple: Beloved Daughter, 1973-1990. A small white lily rested at its base, fresh, fragrant, and recently placed. Behind her, Clarissa Vane stepped forward slowly, hands clasped. Her eyes filled with tears as she knelt and traced her sister's name. I should have come back years ago, she murmured. Jessica said nothing. She knew the weight of guilt was not easily lifted, but it could be shared. I blamed myself for so long, Clarissa continued, not for the fire, but for running, for never telling the truth. I wanted to believe it was all an accident. Jessica placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sometimes we run from what hurts us most, but what matters is what we do when we return. Clarissa nodded. Beatrice doesn't blame me. She remembered that night clearly, but she never told a soul. She said she didn't want to ruin 2 lives. Jessica smiled faintly. She protected you more than you ever knew. They stood together in silence for a moment, before the sound of footsteps approached. Constable Greaves, ever the picture of small-town steadiness, joined them with a respectful nod. Victor Langley has confessed in full, he said. Says it was an accident, and I believe him. He's being held for questioning, but the Crown may consider manslaughter, not murder. Either way, he'll be answering for it. Clarissa looked down. He thought he was saving her. Greaves shook his head. Sometimes the kindest intentions lead to the cruelest consequences. He tipped his cap and walked on, leaving the 2 women in peace. Jessica turned her eyes once more to the grave. I've been thinking about Emmeline's final days, she said softly. She must have known Clarissa was her twin. She'd found out somehow. That's why she insisted they meet at the church. Clarissa nodded. It was her idea. A rehearsal, she said, but really, it was for us. A reunion, a confession. But something went wrong. The oil lamp in the vestry tipped. The flame spread so quickly. Jessica recalled Beatrice's words. She had soot on her hands. You weren't responsible, she said gently. Clarissa wiped her eyes. But I ran. When I saw the smoke, I panicked. I thought they'd blame me. Jessica looked across the churchyard where the bell tower stood tall and quiet. And that silence lasted 20 years, she said. Later that afternoon, the parish hall hosted an informal gathering. Tea was served in china cups, and slices of Victoria sponge were handed out in polite silence. But under the surface, a new peace was settling across the village. Beatrice Langley sat near the window, pale but composed. Clarissa approached her slowly. They spoke in hushed voices. Jessica watched as Beatrice reached for Clarissa's hand. There was no drama. Just 2 women, bound by loss, finding a way to forgive. Victor would likely never return to Maplewick, but his confession had allowed the truth to surface. The village would whisper about it for years, but no longer in fear. Jessica sat with Eleanor near the fire, a fresh pot of tea between them. "I still can't believe it," Eleanor said. "Victor, of all people," Jessica nodded. "He loved his sister deeply, but love can be dangerous when it blinds us." Eleanor took a sip of tea. "And what will you call this one, Jess?" Jessica smiled. "The mask beneath the bell." Eleanor raised her brows. "I thought the poor man died by the gravestone." Jessica laughed softly. "He did, but the real mask, the real deception, was kept high above, hidden in plain sight, waiting to fall." Eleanor shook her head in admiration. "You really do have a way with endings." Jessica looked out the window as the village of Maplewick bustled once more, alive and calm. But as always, beneath the surface of every perfect postcard, a story waited to be told, and Jessica Fletcher would be there to tell it.